Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Game to Grow Webisode project. This is episode 6, which is Culturally Responsible Gaming. I am your host, Jack Birkenstock. I'm the executive director and one of the founders of the Bodhana Group, which is a nonprofit organization that is dedicated to the use and advocacy of tabletop gaming and gaming really in all kinds of forms. We talk about the use of live action role-playing, the use of computer role-playing games and interactive media, basically for therapeutic and clinical benefit. We always make the distinction that if you're not a trained clinician, please do not try to treat your friends or your family with RPG or any kind of gaming, because you can definitely do more harm than good. But the Game to Grow series, if you're a new listener, is basically a series that we have kind of devised with 4 different partners that we have. And what we do is we get professionals, experts, persons in the fields of all kinds of variants to basically come and discuss and share ideas about enhancement of gaming and about the use of gaming for sometimes means that you may not have considered before. It's more than just the fun of being around a table with friends. It's things that can lead to social skills, development of critical thinking. And today's topic, like I said, is culturally responsible gaming. So we're going to have a few experts here, and I'll go ahead and have them introduce themselves in a second. But they all kind of have a stake in exploring cultural relevance in our gaming, cultural education, and just ways that we can be respectful, knowledgeable, and hopefully educational and instructional when we talk about this hobby that we also love so much, which is role-playing. So what I'll do is just kind of have our panel introduce themselves to you, and we'll see all the kind of magic that we have here. So first, let me introduce to everyone Whitney Beltrán, correct? Who also goes by Strix, but she can tell you more about who she is and what she does. So take it away, Whitney.
Thanks, Jack. So as you mentioned, my name is Whitney Strix Beltrán. You got to roll the R, but it's fine for everyone to call me Strix today. I do a lot of things in games. I'm a narrative designer for both video and analog games, so I've worked on an Xbox title as well as stuff for Onyx Path. But I am also a diversity and inclusion advocate and consultant. So I work with companies and individuals to help make their games cooler and open to more markets. And then thirdly, I am an academic. I have a master's degree in Mythological Studies with an emphasis in Jungian depth psychology, which means I look a lot at myth and play and psychology. And I've written peer-reviewed papers on specifically LARP and the Shadow, which was very interesting, as well as hero structures and archetypal stuff. So that's my bag.
Wow, and what a bag it is. Wow, that's what a curriculum vitae there. All right. Next, we'll introduce to you Jason Godesky, who is, well, you wear many hats as well, Jason, which I think is going to kind of be one of the themes that we have today. But why don't you go ahead and let us know who you are?
Well, Jack, you have terribly misrepresented me because I am in no way an expert. I am just some guy who's been down here in the muck trying to figure things out and trying to do my best with this. I read, I write. Mostly I've been working on this game called The Fifth World, which is, the game is actually just one part of a open source shared universe. My wife's writing a novel, and we're open to all kinds of other media that could be used to explore it. I'm really interested in tabletop role-playing games. That's my background. Really interested in especially the story game, indie RPG scene. So that's kind of the background that The Fifth World comes out of. And one of the things in it is imagining what sort of cultures emerge out of 400 years of change into a neo-tribal ecotopian future. So one of the first things you do is build a culture. So I've spent a lot of time really wrestling with the questions of what that means.
Well, and you are an academic as well, correct?
Not really. I'm not anybody that any academic would recognize as an academic. I just read a lot.
Okie doke, fair enough. Next, Mr. Calvin Johns from Anthropos Games. So go ahead and introduce us to you, sir.
Yeah, my name is Calvin Johns, and as Jack mentioned, I'm the founder and lead designer of Anthropos Games, and we have 2 tabletop role-playing titles out, so that's kind of like what the media we focus on with Anthropos. I'm also an academic. I have a PhD in anthropology, and my dissertation was on public forms of play. So I wrote a lot of alternate reality games and kind of played those out actually at some gaming conventions. It was pretty cool. ACON and Gen Con, got to see some of our work there. But we have I do murder mystery events, and we have a murder mystery bar crawl in downtown Austin coming up. And so there's some more live action type stuff that I do just myself as a game designer, but most for Anthropos Games and kind of why I'm here, it's mostly going to be, we'll talk about tabletop role playing, or, I'll kind of focus my comments around that. But yeah, so we have there's actually an alternate reality game book, something coming out in January. I'm not quite sure of the title of it, but maybe I'll have a plug at some point. But yeah, no, that's me. Yeah, so I'll be talking about probably Early Dark, mostly our first title throughout our conversation today.
All right, wonderful. And then finally, but by no means leastly, we have Brian St. Clair King from Vajra Enterprises, which is also a tabletop role-playing game company, is a developer and student of life, just as the rest of us. So go ahead and let us know who you are, Brian.
Well, thanks, Jack. So yeah, I'm the creative director and also the lead writer for Vajra Enterprises, and our main thing is tabletop role-playing games. Myself, my parents were Buddhist ministers, so I kind of got exposed to ideas that were a little different from the culture that I was growing up in, and I think that led me to really be interested in other people's beliefs, the beliefs of other cultures, and that's something that's really guided my writing, the games we choose to publish with Vajra Enterprises. In college, I got a degree in psychology, but I also did a lot of anthropology coursework. I think the main reason I'm here are two books that I wrote and co-wrote. One is Tibet, which is a tabletop role-playing game that takes place in the country of Tibet in 1959, just as the Chinese were starting to take over the country. And it's based on the idea that all Tibetan beliefs are true. So it's played through that lens with mostly Tibetan player characters. The other book that I co-wrote is called Hoodoo Blues, and that's based on the supernatural beliefs of the American South. And the player characters are all ageless Southerners, so people who've lived through large swaths of Southern history. And I did a lot of research into African American beliefs and Native American beliefs of the South for that book.
All right, so as you can see, viewers, we have quite the diverse panel today, and like I said, we're going to get a lot of very great discussion, and it usually kind of goes in directions that we maybe didn't always kind of encounter. So what we'll do here is we'll start out with kind of the I guess the base question of what is culturally responsible gaming. So that, and again, this is kind of the, hey, give a 3-minute definition on what other people could take years to study of their life. So just why don't you go ahead and from your perspectives, share what is culturally responsible gaming, and we'll start with Brian.
Sure. Well, I'd say culturally responsible gaming it's gaming that references cultures other than that of the creators or of the intended audience. So some other culture is referenced, but it's referenced in a way that's respectful to that culture and the people who are part of that culture, that it doesn't reinforce stereotypes of people in that culture. And then it gives accurate info about that culture. It doesn't mislead people about that culture, and can actually be a bridge to learning. Not necessarily, I wouldn't say games need to be, a textbook that you can actually count yourself as knowledgeable after reading, but at least there should be enough accuracy that people don't get wrong impressions about a culture. So that'd be my definition of culturally responsible gaming.
All right, fair enough. Calvin, how would you define culturally responsible gaming?
Yeah, I mean, I think Brian really hit that idea of sort of like representation and responsible representation, which is, surely a really big issue with it. And the kind of idea of like inclusion, right? Or, bringing in something different, something maybe that's not always represented in games. Obviously, especially, I guess in that case, then we're talking about the worlds of the games. And, since the early days of Dungeons and Dragons and things like that, there's been sort of like a Eurocentric focus maybe like Northern European myth or something was kind of, you know, the original base of the hobby in certain ways, right? So I mean, that idea of representation and bringing in other cultures responsibly is really important. I also think there's that side then of, you know, being responsible to, I guess, your own culture, to your audience's culture too, and like you can do progressive work in a culture, right? So games, I guess I think of games as art, and so an artist like does or does not have a responsibility to the world. I mean, they can decide amongst them, you know, in themselves if they want to do something progressive. And I would say then if, you know, you want to be culturally progressive or culturally aware and responsible, then your art, I mean, if you're building these worlds, you're building worlds that people are then going to inhabit, and you make that a world that's worthwhile to inhabit. So things, yeah, that would cut against certain stereotypes for sure, but also even just, I mean, ways of being and associating. Then worlds to inhabit that are somewhat progressive, different. I'll probably mention that a little later, like, you know, what we did with Early Dark. But then also the game, it is a role-playing game. So you are embodying certain kinds of positions. And so you give people a chance to embody positions they might not, you know, embody otherwise. And so it gets them, I mean, they have to then kind of have a way of associating and a way of being, which is probably why games, you know, work for therapy and things like that, right? It's like that idea of how you're embodying and how you're navigating the space. And so then trying to generate that in a progressive way too, right? Maybe include some elements in mechanics and things that force people to act in different ways, right? So as Brian said, you know, representation is really important. Having a culture in your game, a world that's worthwhile to inhabit, and maybe, I mean, I would use the word progressive in a sense. And then also, yeah, having mechanics, a way to embody or a way to inhabit that might be somewhat progressive also.
Nice. Jason? Same question.
Well, there's that old Kurt Vonnegut quote, we are what we pretend to be, so we must be very careful about what we pretend to be. If we pretend to be all the same things that we've always seen all our lives, and then our imagination is reinforcing everything that we're used to. There's a quote from Ursula Le Guin: "The exercise of imagination is dangerous to those who profit from the way things are, because it has the power to show that the way things are is not permanent, not universal, not necessary." So if we can imagine different ways of being, different cultures, different traditions, different ways that people have organized themselves and related to others, then we can start bringing that, or at least know that it's possible, know that what the way things are doesn't have to be taken for granted. So I think culturally responsible gaming, you have it's a responsibility to yourself and the people around the table to know that you're not the only way that human beings could ever be.
Nice. Very, very succinctly said. And Whitney, do you want to finish up, be the cleanup hitter on this initial question?
Absolutely. So I agree that culturally responsible gaming is not just about other cultures, it's about our culture. Games need to be aware that they're in dialogue with culture to be culturally responsible. So that's sort of the first step. And a lot of games don't even get there. So when we talk about culturally responsible gaming, we have to start with awareness that you are in dialogue with culture, period. All games are political because everything is political, right? For me, a culturally responsible game is a game that does not add to prejudice, that does not deepen the cultural scars that we have within our own culture or with other cultures, right? We should never be punching down with games. That's cultural responsibility to me. And then thirdly, games that are culturally responsible need to be made responsibly. And that does touch on games that work with other cultures, indigenous cultures, or cultures that are vulnerable. For instance, I've helped with a project called Mulaka, which is a game about indigenous mythologies based on the Rarámuri people in Mexico. And it was really important to make that game properly by having them as real stakeholders who also financially gained from the making of this game, or it would have been totally inappropriate, right, for the studio to try to make this game. So when we talk about culturally responsible, we have to look at it from design, we have to look at it from message, and we have to look at it for impact.
Okay, so wow, a lot of good ideas. I can tell that this already is going to be a very deep and hearty discussion, which is I think where we really want it to be. So you know, we kind of I guess introduced a little bit of these ideas for this next question. But just I guess to kind of expound again from everybody's, you know, different examples, and you know, from the developer side, which seems that kind of everybody has had that kind of that creator energy, as we could say, to kind of bring these ideas into bearing in different game forms. what are some of the concerns that we talk about with culturally responsible gaming? I mean, I'll give a little bit of example, which actually prompted this whole discussion was in the previous episode, we were talking about religion in gaming and like spirituality in gaming. And I had kind of brought up the example of I'm running a Call of Cthulhu campaign. And one of the creatures that I did, because I rarely use the actual mythos, because that's, it's too easy of a go-to, so I decided I'm going to use a golem. So one of the things that I actually was kind of subconsciously aware of was my portrayal of people of the Jewish faith. Because, and it's kind of weird. I've been watching like a lot of 70s TV on Netflix, and I'm like looking at old episodes of Taxi, and I'm like, oh my God, they could not do that today. Like that would not fly with like a lot of these cultural representations. And it was very interesting the way that I kind of thought of like, you have the stereotypical representation of different people of different faiths and different cultures. And so I know that one thing is, and we kind of touched on that, is like an accurate representation or accurate portrayal. What other concerns, and I'll kind of, switch the order of response here, and I'll actually kind of start with Whitney. What are some of the concerns that you feel that people should have in mind when they're considering this topic? Like what should they be bearing in mind as they're doing this, either in their game or in the design of a game? Where should they start opening up this rich gift of focusing on culturally responsible gaming?
So that's actually a pretty complicated question. There are ways to go about incorporating cultures into your games that are healthier than other ways. And what I mean by that is, in the West, here in the US and in other places in Europe, we are very much stuck in a colonial mindset where we think, well, we'll just listen to other people like us about those cultures, and we'll read books by people like us that wrote about those cultures, but we're not actually going to go talk to those people or hire them or give them the voice to say what their culture is like to us. And I think that is a challenge, right, for logistical reasons. It's sometimes not always possible, but we just, for whatever reason, as a culture, don't think about it. And so if you're going to be adding a culture that you're not familiar with to your game content, it behooves you to directly go out and talk to those people who belong to that culture, and maybe have them write that content for you and pay them. Because if you're going to have representation, you want to make sure you do it authentically, and you want to make sure you do it in a culturally responsible way. And so I know that there's a lot of challenges, there's a lot of nervousness in the industry about doing these things. Well, what if I ask them in the wrong way? Or what if they say no? Or what if they tell me I'm bad or I did it wrong? And those are just things that you have to learn to navigate around as a responsible designer. Not everyone gets it right all the time, and that's totally fine. We expect that people are going to fall on their faces. But what I would expect from people is that they learn from it, and then they go, okay, yeah, I did that thing and it wasn't great. Now I'm going to try something else. Okay,
no, that actually kind of, in the previous episode, one of the guests, Babam, I can't remember the name, I'm so sorry, but he was talking about one of the recent Magic sets that had come out, and it had some Indian influence, and it was just, it was a train wreck. Like the symbology, and like in one card there were like multiple affronts that he was like, well, that wouldn't be there, and this, no, that's not how this is at all. So I think that's, because there's a lot of different systems out there. I think Erdragor is the one that I had heard about recently, which is Native American lore and mythology that was out there. There were some interesting conversations about that, just because of the way that it was represented / misrepresented, from that whole standpoint. Calvin, what do you have to add to this question? What are some of the concerns? Because I know you, with speaking on Early Dark, which I know you're going to be doing, you had quite a hefty load in developing that system, because there's a whole lot of different cultural representation in that game. So why why don't you maybe speak on that with that process?
Yeah, sure. Strix answer was like dead on, right, with this idea of responsibility, I think, for sure. And then if we'll switch gears maybe to the representation again, like you just did, Jack, thank you. Early Dark, when we designed the worlds of the game, so the book has like a 200-page campaign setting in the front of it. And as an anthropologist, as someone who's lived overseas, as someone who studied different kinds of, I studied folklore before I jumped into anthropology, and I really kind of moved to anthropology because I liked the idea of accountability with real people, engaging with real people, not just getting out there, which I'm sure Strix has done as well. So in Early Dark, then each of the cultures started out as a mashup of sort of two real world cultures. One that's sort of these championed or sort of like really popular, overrepresented sort of cultures in traditional tabletop role-playing games. And then one that's, neglected, excluded, demonized, or, somehow, used as trope or used as villain. So one of the cultures then we used, we took the Norse Viking influence and we mixed it with some Inuit culture. And just having, doing research in that, putting things together, just, hopefully to give people to show, hey, there's other ways you can be a badass in a game, right? There's other ways you can, sort of inhabit these spaces. If you have these fantasies, there's other cultures. It's not, there's not just one culture to go to pull up some of these tropes that these gamers want to experience or explore. One of the cultures then was like a Han Dynasty China, which everyone gets from all of, like the Jet Li movies and these big, huge epic films that come out. And then my own studies in Han Dynasty and things like that. And then mixing that with like an Olmec or a South American culture, right? And how many people how many games, give people a chance to really experience that culture as, again, something powerful, something beautiful, something that's worthwhile, something with a deep, rich mythology, something, that is just as ornate and just as sophisticated as any of the Greek or Norse mythologies that that kind of populate a lot of games. So it really was, including these things together, and then letting them obviously take off on their own direction. I mean, it's a fantasy game, or a low fantasy game, but letting those things sort of build out. But just having different look then to the art, having a different look to the characters, having a different feel to the world that kind of gets outside that Eurocentric focus. I guess I would have talked about like race, class, and gender as well if the question wasn't so directed. But these concerns then are kind of even something like capitalism, right? Most games just take capitalism for granted. You're playing some Dungeons and Dragons game and they walk into a store and they see shelves of goods and they exchange money for shelves of goods, and that's not how things happened, even in the place you're kind of half imagining, this like half Renaissance, half Middle Ages, half whatever. That's not how stores operated, right? So building that even into your system, right? Or even the idea of fixed economy, the idea of money economy is what was different, what was money used for, what was it not used for? Are concerns you can think about, right? So definitely cultural representation, how race might be affecting your game, gender, portrayals of gender, I think would be really important. And then class for sure, right? And getting stuff, maybe like shaking that colonial mindset is huge, and that capitalist mindset is huge, right? So shaking that up is equally important, I think, for a lot of my academic work, but then also in games for sure.
Okay. Jason, what do you want to add to that? Or your perspective?
There's definitely a lot of ground of where you find things that are just awful. Like a model who is working for American Eagle Outfitters being put into a Lakota war bonnet. Just wrong. No, there's no gray area there. But there's also, I think there's a large gray area as well, where you'll find two people who are in the same culture who will disagree as to what's appropriate, what's not. You might find two Jewish rabbis who would disagree over whether or not your golem in Call of Cthulhu was okay or not. One who would think it was perfectly fine, another who would think that, no, you screwed everything up, this is not the way it is, and it's very offensive. So you get down into some really sticky questions. There's this irony because, we think of culture as this thing that is self-evident, and of course it exists, but it was only like 100 years ago when we started talking about culture as a thing. And now that anthropology has kind of succeeded in getting everybody to talk about anthropology, or talking about culture, for the past 30 years, anthropologists in journals and conferences, it hasn't really filtered down to textbooks, but it's pretty commonplace for you to have anthropologists asking questions like, does culture even exist? Because it's this abstraction of all of these things that go into our lives. And what culture are you from? You're probably interacting with 4 or 5 different cultures, and which one do you actually belong to? It's when you start getting deeper down, it gets messier and messier, and there's more and more negotiation and more gray, where it's not necessarily that it's totally wrong, but it's also not totally right. And people will have differing opinions. So I think that a lot of times we make it too black and white when there's a lot of places where there is a lot of gray and a lot of ambiguity and a lot of nuance.
Okay, and Brian, want to finish us out on this particular question? I have like one or two follow-ups then after because of course the mind always working, and just some interesting side questions. So we kind of throw it up there. But what do you think are some of the concerns about why this is an important topic?
Yeah. Well, I think for me, one of the main concerns is stereotypes, and I think this is something that games share in common with all other types of media. It's something that's important in movies and novels and television and video games and tabletop games. That stereotypes about people are harmful to those people, to everyone. And some people will say negative stereotypes, but I think all stereotypes are negative. Because, say you stereotype one ethnicity or one culture as being smart, then that automatically implies that other people are less smart. So I'd say all stereotypes are negative, and all stereotypes are harmful. And I think one sees that stereotypes have a real effect on people's real lives. If you look, for instance, at outcomes of African Americans in the medical system, in the legal system, they're treated in a certain way that's based on people's stereotypes of African Americans, and not based on the reality of those individuals and what they need and what's going on with them. And so that's a real harm that's caused by stereotypes. So I think, as a creator, if you want to be a responsible creator and not cause harm in the world, one of the main things that you want to do is avoid perpetuating stereotypes about people. And some of the worst stereotypes are about those foreign people and other cultures, other than those of the intended audience. And so I think it's really important to again avoid perpetuating those stereotypes. I think in gaming, one of the real hotspots for this, one of the really problematic areas are fantasy worlds, made from scratch fantasy worlds and fantasy cultures. Now, I'm not saying that they're always done wrong, but there's a lot of cases where they are done wrong, and I think it's because the authors and the designers say, okay, this is a fantasy culture, and they feel no compulsion to be accurate, even though they're clearly basing their culture off of real world culture. So you've got, your pseudo Africans and your pseudo Native Americans and your pseudo Asians, and with no compulsion to be accurate in representation, because, oh, these aren't real Asians, even though they're obviously, supposed to be Asians. And so that gives the creators this out to not be accurate and not be respectful. And you'll see some really bad, stereotypes and misrepresentation of those cultures, as for instance, the Magic the Gathering sets that we've been talking about. So I mean, that's not the only problem area, but I'd say in gaming that's a big problem area. Another concern I have is cultural appropriation. Is it okay to take a part of someone's culture and take it out of the context of that culture and use it? And I think one of the worst forms of cultural appropriation is when you take something that someone considers sacred and you take it out of that sacred space. So you take sacred words or symbols or sacred stories or sacred rituals, and you take it out of the context in which it's used, in the context in which it's treated, as sacred, and to put it into a non-sacred space. That can be really incredibly offensive to the people that consider that sacred, and I think that is very disrespectful to those people. And then a final concern that I have, and this is a question. It's a question it's been in my head for a while, and I don't really have a good answer for. I wish I did, but is it okay to use other people's cultures for our entertainment? Is it okay for us as designers or players of games to take a culture that belongs to someone else and package that as a product that we use for our entertainment. And I hope that there is a way that's okay, because that's, you know, half the game books I've written. But it's still, I don't think I have the answer to that. I'm hoping that there's a way that it's okay. I think, you know, I really like Strix's suggestion that, you know, you involve the people of that culture to write, and you help them to benefit. So it's not, you know, one side benefiting from someone else's culture entirely. I think that's part of the answer, but I'm not sure if I know the full answer to that question of is it okay, and if it is okay, when is it okay to use other people's cultures for our entertainment?
Well, what I would say is, if I had a follow-up, I think that's a very nice kind of follow-up question. What are your any follow-up thoughts that any of you guys have? I mean, kind of first unclicked Mike kind of gets it. If anybody has any thoughts about, so I like the idea that you brought up about yeah, I see you kind of chomping at the bit of that over there. Because I think that whole idea of appropriation and wanting to explore these cultures, I think that there is some kind of an inherent fear, or an inherent apprehension almost, or maybe it's an inherent disregard. I don't know, but go ahead, extend some thoughts on that, Whitney.
Yes. So I think that there's a significant difference between cultural sharing and cultural appropriation. I'm Mexican American, and I have dealt with appropriation like hurting me personally before, right? And I wanted to highlight my agreement with, for me personally, appropriation should never happen in regards to sacred things, right? That's kind of the hard line for me. If something is a sacred belt that someone would wear, or sacred words, you don't touch it. You don't touch it. And that's just where my personal line is, right? But as far as like, I really like this Japanese thing, and I want to make a game based on a Japanese myth, or I really want to do this thing with this other culture over here. I think what's important to understand is the relative balance, right? When you're appropriating, you're doing that from a place of power over, right? Power over this other culture, because you're taking without permission, essentially. If that culture is of a relative equal power, for instance, Japan, you can still be appropriative accidentally, but it's much more like borrowing, which all cultures do to each other all the time. And so appropriation is borrowing inappropriately, right? We all borrow, but sometimes we do it in a way that is not healthy for us or the culture that we're borrowing from. And so I love cultural borrowing. I'm a mythologist. Like, that's all of mythology is one giant blender of awesomeness. And so I think that there is a lot of anxiety over appropriation right now, and doing it wrong. And I think sometimes some of us get more worried about how it's going to reflect on us than we are worried about why appropriation is bad. And what I mean by that is like the basic, like, oh, I'm more afraid of someone calling me racist than I am of being racist, right? Which is sort of the black and white metaphor for that. And so I think the important part is to push past that anxiety, but also examine it. Like, why am I so afraid to do this thing? Is it because I feel guilty? Is it because I don't want to get in trouble? Or is it because I really, truly care about these people and I want to make sure that they are comfortable as a group as much as they can be, because groups don't all agree, they're not monolithic, with what I'm doing with this thing. And so it is a gray area and it isn't a gray area at the same time. And that's very confusing to a lot of people. And so, you know, my big thing is like iteration. Try, get it wrong, do it again, try some more.
Well, I mean, I guess just, and it doesn't have to be just you in this case, but I think maybe for the benefit of, because for some of our listeners, because again, all of you have anthropological basis of some sort, you know, with the terminology. What is the, I guess, the simplest way for maybe some of our listeners who may not be as up on the lingo, so to speak? Because I know there's a lot of different terms, and even I'm kind of asking, I guess, partially for my own benefit, you know, I'm more of the, you know, the psychology, you know, social sciences kind of thing that my area is delving into the mind, mindfulness, kind of that thing. I love the predominantly Buddhist panel today in belief. Yes, all right. But we have terms like appropriation. We also have terms like assimilation. Like what are some of these ideas so people can get an understanding, I guess, of what the differences are? Because there are a lot of different forms of interaction between different cultures and kind of what can happen as a result of those mashups. And I think you really nailed one of the big kind of central issues. And sometimes I kind of do devil's advocate questions or directions here, you know, kind of representing people go, well, what's the big deal? You know, I like Native American culture, so I did a myth. So what? You know, I'm honoring those people, you know, and folks have that kind of internal protection system. That's not the way I feel. I'm just throwing that out there. But what are these ideas of like appropriation versus assimilation? You know, what is healthy borrowing versus unhealthy? So if, I don't know if you want to start us out and then we kind of share the definition stick, or
I would say let the PhD anthropologist take the first stab.
Ooh, no pressure, Calvin.
Yeah, no, well, I mean, I think everything Strix said before, I mean, is true, right? I mean, this idea of, you know, like the appropriation being inappropriate borrowing, right? And the example I used, I forget who it was, like the governor's daughter wearing the headdress on her Instagram or something, right? And it was, you know, how can this, it was like the governor of Arizona's daughter or something, right? Was had this headdress and took these pictures, and it got out and I was like, whoa, like that's incredibly inappropriate borrowing. And one of the things I would, use in class, just as examples are, you know, if you are borrowing something that your culture has had a hand in destroying, then that's inappropriate, right? Like, I mean, a headdress like that, like literally settlers moving into that particular area of the country made it impossible for certain particular tribes to, you know, construct those headdresses, to practice their religion the way they wanted to live on their land the way they wanted to. And so they've taken away, I mean, they've literally, you know, they made it impossible for First Nations people or Native peoples in the United States region then to participate in that, to make those headdresses, to have those festivals, to have those rituals. And so if your culture has been a part of destroying that, to then demonstrate, like, look what I made, because I've, you know, made it impossible for you to make these things. Now I'm making what you're not allowed to make, right? Even things like language, right? If you send an entire group of people, you being, you know, if your culture that maybe you identify with or feel something with, obviously people are individuals, attached to a culture, or you're visibly recognized as a member of, like, you know, white American culture, as I would be then, to, you know, even something about indigenous languages in the United States. I mean, people were sent to schools to eradicate certain Native American languages, right? They were, I mean, that culture was literally forcibly stripped. And so to then, for me then to celebrate that after, you know, certain, I mean, and my, you know, family wasn't here at those times or whatever, you know, I think that would be a cop-out for me to say, well, my people never did that. I mean, obviously I'm part of this American culture in a certain way. And to, you know, to see what was forcibly sort of stripped from people because it was hated or demonized or vilified at a certain time, and now to celebrate it as aesthetically beautiful, I think, you know, might be my, you know, one of those test cases that I would use for explaining appropriation, or explain those inappropriate forms of borrowing. But yeah, I mean, it's going to be a personal sort of issue, right? And I think Strix mentioned too, like, we're not really a police force out there to, like, point out, like, haha, you did it wrong. You know, that's really bad, right? Like, that makes people anxious. That makes people a little, you know, timid about learning things, or even exploring as a designer, exploring something new. So I think, yeah, that's a really good point, right? No one's there to, like, pounce and, like, call out bad things. If we talk about it, we're exploring that anxiety, right? We're exploring why that was a failure, why that was a stumble. And so, I mean, really, we're going to be redefining these lines all over the place. And it's just good, you know, to explore that anxiety, I guess. I thought that was a really productive term.
Okay.
One thought on that. You know, Strix talked about the power imbalance, and I'd say, you know, that's a really important thing to consider is if you do something that offends someone and they call you on it, you know, do you as a designer feel that you can just brush that off and say no, or that you have to actually, you know, respond to that in a respectful way? And whether you feel you do or don't, I think is indicative of is there a power imbalance. You know, I always like to, in conversation about, you know, respectful speech and, you know, calling people what they want to be called, you know, I always think of it as, you know, would you call your boss this? No, because because you would speak respectfully to your boss because your boss has power over you. If you're going to treat someone else who doesn't have any power over you and has very little social power in a certain way, that you would treat your boss that way, then that's you're having a double standard there. And I think we should strive to treat everyone as we would treat our boss, and be respectful of them. And I think if someone has said, okay, you're using my culture in a way that I don't like, then as a designer or author or whatever, you have two choices. You can sort of brush it off and say, I don't have to deal with your concerns, or you can take the respectful route and say, okay, I'm gonna listen to your concerns, and I'm gonna do whatever I can to treat you in that respectful way.
Jason, any thoughts on this little secondary question here that's generated some great discussion so far?
Well, Calvin was saying about indigenous languages, and I've listened to a lot of indigenous people saying that they would really like to hear more settlers learning their languages. In fact, even to the point of being kind of angry that more settlers don't learn their languages, that's a sign of disrespect. And I think if you think about the cultural dynamic, when the conquerors start learning the language of the conquered, that's how you start to reverse that banning that happened. Settlers came in, said, you can't speak your own language, you can't practice your own customs. How do you reverse that? How do you make it okay for them to speak their own language? A lot of times, if you see the powerful white people speaking your language, that legitimizes it again, and you get a lot of people who start speaking it. I've read this one story about Tuvan throat singing. It was dying out. So some anthropologists went over to Tuva and were recording some of the last elders doing this throat singing, and they put it on their MP3 files, and it leaked out over Napster at the time. And a bunch of American kids were getting these MP3s of Tuvan throat singing, and word got back to Tuva that this was the cool new thing among the teenagers in America. And all of a sudden, all the kids were going to their grandparents saying, teach me how to do throat singing. And now the tradition is no longer dying out. So I'm not saying that you're wrong, Calvin, at all. I actually agree with a lot of what you're saying. But again, you very quickly go past the surface level and you get into this kind of gray morass where it's more complicated. There's more feedback and interaction.
Well, I think it, in terms of, I'm sorry, did you want to respond back to that, Calvin? Just great discussion.
Sure. No, I think Jason was totally correct. Yeah, there's always something more. There's always, things to move past. And if there was, if there is an opportunity, again, to champion or, if you find yourself naturally in a position to be an advocate for something, go right ahead, right? That's perfect. I, as a designer, probably wouldn't go out and try to pick something to champion, right? I would feel like, what's my place to do that, right? But as someone, with particular heritages, or someone, who happened to learn Sanskrit for a master's degree and then spent a lot of time in India, if I'm hanging out with people, at my office job and they're talking something about, Indian culture, I might say, okay, I have an actual experience in some South Asian myth, South Asian language. So I'm going to then, do what I can. Yeah, like Jason said, right, to kind of, to give that a different life or put a different perspective on that for, maybe the people at my office or people playing my games or something. But yeah, if you don't, I guess I would just say, if you don't sort of already have that position, going on seeking out little champion causes, I guess that does work. I've seen it, sort of bomb a lot of times too. But yeah, everything Jay said was totally.
Yeah, I think in general, one of the things that this conversation has kind of brought up, and I think that it's very healthy when we have this discussion, because Strix kind of introduced it in part, this kind of idea where I think it is this inherent conflict, or there's a lot of talk. I think more so even when just I was younger. I'm only 44. I'm definitely no ancient one here, but this whole idea of I as a person who is representative of white culture, just by my look, well, you can't talk about this, or you can't talk about that, or I can't discuss this. Where I think that there is, I forget who exactly said it, was about the whole idea of balance. where, there is some degree of, for us to be respectful, we do need to engage or explore something foreign or alien to ourselves. But at the same time, we have to do it in a way that is responsive and responsible at the same time. And I think that that's also that balance on the other side of, I think that sometimes folks, for good reason, are maybe very protective of that cultural identity and that cultural heritage because of the fact that it has been so kind of exploded and blown up or overrun or, completely almost squashed out in the past. So I think that's definitely kind of a sticky wicket, shall we say, of how to get this out there, because it's like we avoid the conflict because it's very uncomfortable for multiple reasons, but we kind of need that conflict to at least generate that discussion. But it's kind of how to talk calmly inside of an explosion is I guess somewhat how this idea might kind of get explored. So to kind of, I guess, take that partially into our next question, we all are definitely passionate in our own different ways. So what are some of the ways that your thoughts or your ideas about culturally responsible gaming, maybe, from your own cultural inheritance? I know that earlier, Brian, you were mentioning about, some of your cultural education and some of your upbringing that, may have in turn gone on to the development of Tibet. So why don't we kind of start there? Like, how has this idea really impacted what you do in your professional life, in your gaming identity, or, so Brian, why don't you start us out? How does culturally responsible gaming impact what you do?
Yeah, well, it impacts me in that I worry a lot. When I publish a game like Tibet or Hoodoo Blues, I worry that I will have made a mistake and said something wrong about the culture in question, that I will have believed something from a source that is not, accurate representation of that culture. I worry that someone will find it disrespectful. But again, even though I do worry about those things, I still want to keep publishing these games, and all I can do is to do the best that I can. Do lots of research, try to hear from the people themselves that I'm writing from, not just some white person describing another person's culture, but to hear from those people themselves. And even though I worry a lot, all I can do is just to try to do the best I can and try to do the most complete and accurate job that I can, researching that culture. For instance, in a book I wrote recently, is a cyberpunk book, source book, and I had one NPC that I was writing about who I wanted her to be Romani, which is what some people, the Romani people get called gypsies, although they don't like to be called gypsies. They prefer to be called Romani. So there's just one NPC, one page out of a what ended up being about a 300-page book, and I ended up doing a bunch of research because I started doing a little research, and then I thought, okay, I just need to do a little more to make sure that I'm actually getting the culture right. And then I ended up doing a little bit more, and it ended up being, many hours of research for, like I say, one page out of a 300-page book. But, I wouldn't have felt comfortable, if I couldn't have done all that research, if I didn't have the time to do all that research and double check my sources and make sure that I was getting the culture right, then I wouldn't have felt comfortable including that NPC. I would have wanted to not make her be Romani, but then that would have been a shame. That would have been a shame to not have a Romani NPC in the book and to replace her with a Caucasian Anglo-Saxon non-Romani character. I mean, that would have made the book, the diversity in the book less, and that would have been a shame. So again, I worry a lot, but I still push through and let the worrying push me to try to do the work and try to be as accurate and respectful as possible.
What just again to just kind of, because I'm fascinated by not only, like I said, Tibet and also Seekers. I mean, were there any challenges that you encountered with something? I mean, because Tibet is a pretty large undertaking because it has a lot of, it has a lot of cultural pieces, a lot of like mysticism, quote unquote. I mean, what were some of the challenges in representing that, or with Seekers, where you're actually representing multiple different philosophies and like you were kind of combining literally, it's almost like a menu of options of how to approach the world in one system. Like, what were some of the challenges due to culturally responsible gaming?
Yeah. Well, with Tibet, and even though my parents, like I said, were Buddhist ministers, they were trained in a Japanese Mahayana Buddhist tradition. So culturally, I had very little knowledge, just sort of a passing knowledge of Tibetan culture and Tibetan religion, but enough to let me know, wow, this is a really fascinating subject and a really fascinating worldview, and something I would love to write about. So again, I started doing research, and I did talk to some Tibetans, but for the most part it was book research, because that's what I mostly had access to. One of the challenges was I wanted to I started off saying, okay, everything that Tibetans believe is true. That's the premise of the game. But it turns out there's not just one Tibetan belief. There's Tibetan folk beliefs. There's the beliefs of the trained monks who have been trained in this really intense system of logic and philosophy. And the things those two groups believe about the universe are very different. And so there was no one Tibetan belief system, no one Tibetan worldview that I could put into the game. So I ended up, saying, okay, well, I'm gonna pick and choose, as a game, and try to represent some of the diversity in the text of the game, and put in a little text box and say, well, this is what folk people believe, and this is what the trained, monks believe. But at times I just had to pick and choose and say, well, this is more interesting. This viewpoint of things is more interesting and is going to make for a better game. So I did end up having to do that. Another big challenge was a lot of the stuff that's published by Tibetans about Tibetan beliefs are of the more philosophical form of Tibetan beliefs, and less about the folk beliefs, because the people who end up writing books in English are the Tibetans that have gone through this academic monastic system. So a lot of the folk beliefs, the books that contain that information were a lot of them were written by European and American explorers who went into Tibet and started writing about the beliefs. But it was really difficult because I had to view those through a really critical eye and say, okay, this is being filtered through the prejudices of the people who are viewing this culture, and I can't take any of this at face value. I can take it as a suggestion of what people might have believed and try to verify that through other sources. So for instance, there are groups that, if you go look at some of the early books on Tibetan magic and folk belief and stuff, there are groups of Tibetans that get called sorcerers, which carries this connotation of these are people who do, they're basically magic mercenaries who do harmful magic for money or to attack their enemies. And if I took those, that English translation of sorcerer and the English representation of these groups of people at face value, then I would have ended up saying these are people who do harmful magic and are basically the equivalent of the bad witches of European legend. But checking that against what Tibetans actually are saying, it turns out no, this group of people that the white explorers called sorcerers, they're actually these lay practitioners, these Buddhist and Bon lay practitioners who are sometimes you might feel that you could go one of them to deal with an enemy, but they're also people who can teach religion and can officiate over wedding ceremonies, and have a more complex role in the culture than just these are the bad guy magicians. So it was really that was really difficult to tease out the prejudice from what's actually true to that culture.
Okay. Strix, same question. What are some of the ways that you incorporate all these ideas into your game design? Actually, I love that you mentioned Onyx Path. Rich Thomas, very good friend of Bodana, very good friend of ours. Wonderful guy. But yeah, go ahead. Same question.
Yeah, so cultural responsibility heavily impacts my work, and in fact, it may be a touchstone. One of my most recent projects was Onyx Path, and it was Scion, second edition. I sat on confab after confab with our core dev team going, how do we do this better this time? I loved the first Scion, I played it, but there was some egregious stuff in it, right? Like they took whole pantheons and were just like, they're the same thing, why not? And you know, we just weren't going to do that again. And so we spent a long time thinking, not just writing, but thinking about, okay, we have a responsibility to represent these beliefs and these gods in a way that is not harmful to people. And this is still a game for a Western audience that has to work and be fun. So what do we do? And so I ended up being in charge of the Aztec pantheon, because I did ethnographic research in South America and Central America, and I'm Mexican, and like that's my bag as far as mythology goes. That's where I have most of my emphasis, is Central and South American religious systems. And we have always been very careful and conscientious because it's important to us. So that's one example. Another example is my game, Bluebeard's Bride, which is a game about, you know, the original fairy tale of Bluebeard, which is all about sexualized violence. So how do we play a game that centers on sexualized violence in a culturally responsible way that doesn't harm people? And that took us 2 years, right? It was a successful game. It kickstarted amazingly well. But we had to stop and think at every corner. We want to do this the right way for us and also for other people. How do we make this game responsible and not harmful? And so one of the things we did is we ensured that Bluebeard, the main antagonist, will never, ever, ever be a sympathetic character. Like, we designed it from the ground up so that that just does not happen, because we didn't want that to be a gray area that the game explored. It was important to us. For what we were going for and what we were representing, feminine horror, like, it has to be from a feminine viewpoint. And if you have that urge to shift it to a masculine viewpoint because you're uncomfortable, great, sit with that. But you don't actually get to do that in our game. You can do that in a different game. So that's another great example of cultural responsibility directly impacting my design. But also I've worked on, like I said, projects like Mulaka. I've given talks at GDC about Indigenous game design and why it's important and how it might be an avenue to basically make sure that dying cultural knowledge doesn't die, that it stays iterative and alive. Because as soon as you write it down in a book, you kill it. So how do we take these oral traditions and give them more vibrancy and give them other avenues to survive, not just for our consumption, but within their own cultures? So I've started recently 2 new projects. One of them that focuses on Eastern mythology, and then another one that's very local to Seattle. And the Seattle project is especially very interesting because, as mentioned before, some of these cultures have cloistered in on themselves and says, no, you can't take from us anymore. So if I want to incorporate that, should I? How do I talk to these people? Where do I get my information for my research? What is the best way to do this in the right way? So all the time, all my projects, it's super important.
Okay. Jason, same question. Nice.
Earlier, Brian was mentioning about fantasy worlds where where the fantasy world is way less interesting than the actual real life historical culture and tradition that they're pulling from, and like that's really bad sign for your game if your fantasy world is less fantastic than the real world. You should be going for more fantastic. So in the fifth world, there's a cultural appropriation policy because we have the open source aspect where you record what happened in your game and you add the family that you came up with and the customs that they follow, and that becomes background that everybody else can use. But we have in there, in order to, because when you start imagining what a sustainable future might look like, there's a lot of people who are going to go lean on indigenous stereotypes to get there because they have a hard time imagining more authentic ways of doing it. And so what we put in the cultural appropriation policy is like probably the best strategy for getting past that is asking more questions. You're being lazy. You're not going deep enough. Like, so you all wear Lakota war bonnets? Like, what point did your ancestors think that was a good idea? Where did that come from? Don't you have your own history that you're going to pull from that's going to change over time? Go back to, and that's going to make it more interesting. It's going to make it a better story because you have a more vibrant, alive setting that you're in. Your family has a actual history that you can see in the way that they developed over time. So our approach to getting past cultural appropriation is basically, if you're appropriating, you're probably not digging hard enough. You should go deeper. And if you go deeper, you're going to be rewarded with something that's not going to be appropriative, but it is going to be a lot more interesting.
Well, I was going to just kind of a brief follow-up. I know this past year at Save Against Fear, no, that is not a shameless plug, there were you did some great playtest sessions of Fifth World, and there was actually one of the players, I won't name by name, but he had kind of come away from that table like he was like, I explored issues in my family that, like, he literally came away from what was like a 2 to 3 hour session with like this cathartic moment just by exploring some of those deeper identities. So I mean, what is an example of some of that deeper exploration that Fifth World offers? Like what is a little of that process? Because I think exploring culture kind of reverberates back onto a lot of the conversation that we've had already about people kind of, having this inherent fear about true cultural exploration and true exploration of other systems other than their own. And I think that, as everybody, in the panel has kind of said, we can't be afraid of that. Which definitely tickles my mindfulness button. It's important why we have these reactions and these feelings, and that's part of how we grow is by challenging our own level of comfort. Discomfort breeds change. That's one of kind of my personal life philosophies. So what is that whole process within that system?
Early on, we had a lot of playtests where people really wanted to go like Mad Max with this, because you're talking about after civilization and the people are living in tribal societies. So people immediately go to, it must be violent and terrible. Like this is Mad Max Beyond Thunderdome. And it's supposed to be more of an ecotopian kind of setting. And so we had a hard time. How do we get people there without just clubbing them over the head over this is the way it's supposed to be? And one of the ways that really worked with that was you would step through the history. We've divided up into 4 segments, and so each time there would be like this question and a spectrum. Like the first one is, how did your family deal with the end of civilization? And on one end is pioneer, where they had like an ideology that they were pursuing, and that could be like, we're a permaculture group that started a homestead out there, all the way to we were a militia group hiding out in the wilderness of Montana. Whatever the ideology may be, you had some very strong opinions about where the world was going to go, and you were ready when things started going sideways. And on the other end is just, no, we just tried to make do and survive as things got bad. And where did your family fall on this spectrum? And no one's all the way on the left and no one's all the way on the right. But depending on where you land, you would have different questions that would create the customs that define your family's culture. And since you're going through this, and every single time, the questions are geared towards, how did your family survive this part of your history? When you get to the end of it, you might disagree with some of those customs. You might not think that they're great ideas. You may not think that they're still relevant. You may think that they need to be changed. And a lot of the game then focuses on that dynamic because each character is defined by your relationship to one of those customs, and you either embody that custom, or you rebel against it, or you aspire to it, or you subvert it, because no culture is monolithic and we all relate to different parts of our culture differently. And from that comes the dynamic between the characters, and often centering on this debate of what do we think about our family's culture? How do we want to change it? Where do we want to go from here? But you have seen each one of those customs coming from a specific point in their history when it helped them survive and it helped them get through and it helped them. And now we have them each connected to one of 5 basic values that we took from Jonathan Haidt's research, where it's either compassion or fairness or loyalty or honor or purity. So they're all rooted in something that, at least theoretically, you can understand the aspiration of. So you end up with a family that you basically respect, and you're invested in them doing well. And now it kind of shifts this tone towards, this is kind of something that I respect and admire, and we are dealing with a future that, on some level, I like. So you're not rebelling against. It's not a post-apocalyptic, terrible thing where everything has fallen and you're trying to rebuild something good. You're grappling with how to make a good thing better, and I think on a basic level that does often connect to some really important things. And there is a level on which the more of yourself that you put into it, the more of yourself you're going to get back from it, and the more of that cathartic experience you're going to get. And it invites you to do exactly that. But you can still play it pretty superficially. But even if you do, it's still going to be a story about how do you make a good world better, rather than how do you rebuild from the ashes of something that was utterly destroyed.
Nice. I like as we're kind of coming through here, and after we get through to Calvin, because I'm sure we're going to talk about Early Dark, I am going to kind of bounce back to you, Strix, for a moment, because I would like you to expound a little bit more on Bluebeard's Bride, just because I like the idea of talking about some of our cultural sexual ideologies, because that's something a lot of games really, 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 really don't touch on, at least in a way that we want them to. Like, I don't have to, maybe everybody knows that, the elephant on the couch is the game Fatal, which is just an absolute abomination. But when we talk about, different ideas, it really speaks to what gaming can offer in terms of different ways of looking at this. So I'll definitely, hang on to that, because I want to hear more about that, especially because of some of the work that I do with people who have either suffered sexual abuse or people who have perpetrated. That's one of my specialties in counseling. So, Calvin, what were some of the challenges that, or what are some of the ways that you've utilized culturally responsible gaming in what you do?
Yeah, sure. Well, yeah, I mean, as an anthropologist, it's really, it's just as like an activist, a progressive anthropologist at a, theoretically driven progressive department at the University of Texas. It's kind of everything I do. As a person, as an advocate, as an ally, it's, what I try to spend my life doing. So the games, I think, Strix and Brian have both mentioned, like dealing with real world cultures, right? And dealing responsibly. Those are issues that definitely come up as an anthropologist that writes ethnography and works and does ethnography. But as a game design thing, I guess, again, I'll try to take the other side then. I consider myself an artist, and a lot more like Ursula Le Guin. I think, Jason mentioned that really good quote, right? I'm creating cultures. It's a sci-fi in the sense, all fantasy is sci-fi. I think of it as like critical, progressive, a way to help us sort of like, shake us up, discomfort your players in a certain way. So with Early Dark, having these cultural mashups was really, that was just a gesture to inclusion in a certain way. The point was that the player couldn't hide in any of the regular sort of Eurocentric tropes, right? Like, I don't think we really accurately represented Han Dynasty China. That wasn't, entirely the purpose of that. The purpose was to someone playing the game kind of just couldn't tell the Tolkien-esque tale, nothing against Tolkien, right? But they couldn't tell that sort of, that wandering, Early Dark, you don't have alignment to some abstract ideology. You have memberships and ties to social groups, right? So there's no such thing as like objective belief structure. You are tied and invested in your social groups, and that's how you go up levels, right? It's like you invest more, you must be responsive to them. They are responsive to you. If you want to get a horse, you don't use money, you play on your ties and things like that, right? So And people got really upset that we use the word alignment to talk about that, right? And they're like, well, are you chaotic good or are you chaotic evil? And we're like, that doesn't make any sense. That's not how people behave. I'm going to take care of these people because I'm loyal to them. I hate these people because my people hate these people, right? And so even like something like alignment, we treated very differently, right? We treated it in a I guess, what I would say is a progressive way, right? So it wasn't so much for us, the goal wasn't so much representation of culture, which I think, like I said, Strix and Brian are speaking to very responsibly, very well. I mean, it's this kind of idea of, you know, of like art, right? Or like producing a game that shakes that up, right? And not allowing that space. And also Early Dark has 2 of the cultures have 3 genders, right? So 2 of the 5 cultures in the game have 3 genders, and people are like, well, what do their parts look like? And then I can say, well, sex and gender are 2 different things, right? And it allows me to kind of even talk about the sex gender system and biopower and, you know, things that come up at panels and things at conventions, right? And, you know, like we still made them biologically driven. So one of the cultures, the 3rd gender, are like left-handed people, right? So all left-handed people are then considered of a different gender. And we make them artisans in certain ways, right? We could talk about right brain versus left brain, and, you know, we get a little scientific with it, right? But so these left-handed people then are considered a different gender. So it's still biological. It's still based on the body in a way that, you know, the gender system has been, and, you know, a lot of people would talk about it. But people are like, that's sci-fi. You know, this is a fantasy game. How dare you make it sci-fi? How dare? And we're like, no, well, how dare you? I mean, we're just talking about different cultures. Other cultures in the world have a different gender system that's not quite as binary as things are in the West, right? And so it's, I guess for me then, it wasn't so much the representation of real cultures as sort of pushing these buttons, right? As an anthropologist, pushing these things, you know, showing again, like that Ursula Le Guin quote, that nothing about our Western world is necessary or natural, right? Like humans may have natural needs. We have no natural way of meeting those needs. Like that's what culture is, right? Like our attempt to meet these very natural objective needs in the most crazy, amazing, you know, ways we can. So, yeah, and like, you know, even something like race, you know, having, you know, we don't use the word race, we use the word heritage in the game, right? And then like the introduction to Early Dark, there's a thing like, you know, the word race is problematic for certain reasons. We use the word heritage in certain ways here, right? And we kind of have a little blurb about that, about the different heritages then in the game of Early Dark and how we'll respond to that. And I mean, just as I guess as maybe an anecdote, then that we were at Gen Con one day, I was meeting with one of our artists in like Artist Alley, if you've been, you know, in the big exhibit hall of Gen Con. And he was talking to an art director from Games Workshop, and I was walking by and he's like, oh, Calvin, come here. And he's, you know, he was saying, yeah, I was just telling him about how you pointed out to me that whenever I draw for you, you know, all the illustrations he'd been doing for us. And he's like, yeah, all my heroes look like Caucasian people, and they have Caucasian hair and they have Caucasian facial features. And then every time I draw a goblin or an orc for you, it has, you know, different kinds of hair, different kinds of facial features. He's like, you were the first art director that ever pointed that out to me. And he's like, it's like all over. I mean, look at World of Warcraft, look at anything, right? Like, and I was like, well, yeah, you know, so I mean, it wasn't so much then I wasn't talking about real world cultures, right? But just handling it or pushing that game the same way I would push my anthropological work, or the same way I would push on my relationships with friends, or the jokes I would tell, or the jokes I would make sure not to laugh at, you know, I mean, just, you know, the things that like in my day-to-day life, I guess I do that with the art and with the game too, so.
Yeah, I mean, I think, again, kind of speaking, you know, person and system specific, because I very much what we produce reflects very highly on who we are and what our systems of belief are. One of the things I think that also makes, from a cultural standpoint, very, very unique about Early Dark, and it's something I really haven't encountered in a lot of other systems. Now, granted, I haven't played Fifth World yet, so it sounds like there's kind of a connection at least there. But I really like the idea that in Early Dark, you don't start with a statted sheet that you then fit into the world. You actually start, and maybe you could speak a little bit on that, because that's definitely, I think, very culturally relevant as how character generation and even how people think about character and what their character is in Early Dark actually starts from a very different place, which I think is a very natural way to introduce cultural exposure and where we come from. Could you speak to that for a moment or two?
Yeah, I mean, so in Early Dark, you couldn't really start with a concept of a character, because and this actually goes back to some of my Buddhist beliefs personally, right? But this idea of what is identity, what is personhood, you know, and then I guess as a sort of a progressive anthropologist and a Deleuzian and Nietzscheaner, you know, having these ideas that, yeah, you don't start with a concept and like build a person. You actually the group rolls up sort of like a scenario that's happening, and then you sort of pick like which person you want to be in that scenario. So if you roll over like, you know, the large beast escapes from the cart and the town is thrown in turmoil, go. And then you would kind of pick, okay, maybe I'm the guy that owned the beast. Maybe I'm the one who's, who's like protecting my stall from whatever. And you kind of like start in the game and then build out your memberships or build out your alignments from that. And even like the stat system it's aptitude. So it doesn't say how strong you are. It says how apt you are to use strength, or, your body size, we call it labor, but how apt you are to fight. The stats actually could play out for animals, humans. A Venus flytrap, could have a high guile and a high fight, but like a low labor, right? Our aptitudes are very abstract as well. But yeah, so you couldn't really start with a concept. You're not creating an individual and then putting them in a place. That's not how individuality, or that's not how personality, that's not how, I would believe that the person develops. So you start with a situation and then you grow an individual sort of out of that, just in like maybe your first session or just an hour before. But yeah, we really wanted to make that a big part. And maybe that's, to this about cultural responsibility. And a lot of it is just the personal sort of like the Buddhist side of things too.
All right. Yeah, I mean, I definitely thought it was worth mentioning because I think it helps kind of start people off with an understanding of how we are a product of cultural inheritance, whether that be a larger culture or heritage, as culture, or, like our school system and like the culture of our friends, or, various subcultures that we have, that there's all these things informing who we are and what we do. And I think that gaming has, just kind of one of the big paint swatches, if you will, of the Game to Grow Webisode project has been this idea as gaming being more than just a game. That we utilize the safe space of play to explore uncomfortable ideas in a way that seems less abrasive, it seems less invasive, and it doesn't seem like I think, Jason, you said it earlier, it's not like I have someone beating cultural appropriateness over the head with a club of learning. I have these experiential moments where I'm engaging something that challenges the way that I think. I again, before I go to you, Strix, and Bluebeard's Bride, I often point to one of the other Vajra systems, Kid World, which, I mean, talk about uncomfortable source material. Like, it's in the future. Kids are the only viable work option. So you're talking about very real themes of people being taken advantage of in this culture, and that is a dark side of humanity that for like or hate, it unfortunately exists. And I think that in a lot of ways these games can be used as educational moments. They can be used as growth moments in a way that endears a person to that process of personal challenge, rather than being something that today you're going to learn to respect other people's cultures, play, which definitely is not a good way to, to teach or engage someone. But, kind of like, oh, okay, that would be, that would be very interesting. A lot of your psychology experience and education definitely bleeds over into systems like that, where you talk about like cognitive distortions as actual world views of the player characters. And that, to me, like, that's fascinating, just that you can do that in the context of a game. So let me drop back over to Strix here for a moment and just tell it, because everybody's kind of had the little like kind of game plug moment. I just want to make sure I'm giving kind of equal airtime here, so to speak. Plus, like I said, I've been a therapist for about 16 years. I've been working with people with sexually problematic behaviors, and I very strongly personally believe that we underrepresent sexual education in a very proper way, and we have this culture that girls keep it as long as you can, guys take it away as quick as you can. So we're already at this variance. So I'm very intrigued, and I think that it's another side of culture that you're speaking to in a very direct way. So why don't you tell us a little bit about Bluebeard's Bride?
Sure, I would love to. No, not at all. So Bluebeard's Bride is a tabletop RPG. It's a one-shot with replay value, and it is a horror game. Capital H horror game. Like, this is not a game that I would recommend for everybody, or everybody in different stages of their lives. You got to be the right person in the right stage of your life, especially if you're a woman. But it's based off of the original fairy tale of Bluebeard, which, if you're not familiar with, basically there's a very rich nobleman who has a habit of marrying young women, and then they disappear, and then he will marry another one. And so the story takes place with a young woman getting married to Bluebeard, him giving her the keys to his mansion and saying, you can go anywhere in this mansion except for this one room with the smallest key, or else I will punish you, blah, blah, blah. And you're never allowed to go in there. And then he leaves. He's like, oh, and I got to go on a business trip. Bye. And so it's a setup, right? It's a psychological trap. And the young bride explores the house, but it's nagging at her like, what's in this room? Why won't he tell me? I'm the lady of the house. I should know. And eventually she opens that last room and she finds the bodies of the previous wives. And of course, this is when he comes home, dramatically, and is like, you found out, now I have to kill you. And because it's a fairy tale, it has variants. But the one that we work with is the one in which he actually, cuts off her head and sticks her in the room, and that's the end. So that's the fairy tale that the game is built off of. And when we set out to make this game, myself and my two co-designers, Marissa Kelly and Sarah Richardson, we wanted to make this about the feminine experience of horror. Feminine horror is an established genre in books and cinema, and it had not really been done in tabletop before, to our knowledge, especially the gothic flavor that we were going for. And so when we decided to do this, we're like, okay, we're not going to pull any punches. Like, this is an adult game, it's for adults, and we're going to be artistic and true to what we know. And so the game itself is, I'm one of the designers. It's wonderful. There are a lot of people who play this game for various reasons. And it's interesting how it pans out across genders. Women who play this game often feel very cathartic. They feel validated and heard. And they're like, this is great. I love this game. In a very broad brush, more masculine people, men who play this game, often feel very horrified. And very intensely cloistered and shut in and robbed of agency in ways that they're not used to. And so they'll go like, wow, my mind is blown. Like, I had never been in that space emotionally or psychically before. Holy crap. And it was great and I loved it, but it was so intense, maybe I will not play that again. But when we talked about how we were going to do violence, because this game is about violence to the feminine, we knew that we had to not pull the punches, but we also had to do it in a way that people weren't going to walk away from the game damaged or scarred or activated or any of the number of things that could happen. And so we start that at the very, very beginning, by saying, full transparency, this is what the game is about, and this is how it ends. You know before you sit down at that table what you are in for. Like, there are not happy endings here. That is not what you're playing for. And if you want a happy ending, or if you don't want to do this, cool. Like, our feelings are not hurt. Go play Ryutama and have a wonderful time. And so we make it very clear that, like, if you don't think you're going to have a good time playing this game, don't do it. But if you're curious to give it a shot, why not? And so we decided to illustrate the tone and flavor and experience of feminine horror through our mechanics. Very specifically. I'm a believer as a designer that, like, exposition is fine, but if you want someone to actually experience a culture or a thought paradigm that they're not used to, you have to do it through mechanics. You have to force them, essentially. And so many of our mechanics harp on feminine horror, robbing you of agency, making it so that you have two choices, but they're both bad. Making it so that you cannot fight your way out. You cannot just grab your sword and hack the thing and win. That's not an option. And so when it's not an option, what do you do? And that's really what we're asking people to experience with this game, is when full agency is off the table and you don't have good choices, what does that mean for you as a person? Who are you? And how do you deal with that? How does your mind ingest that? And so very early on in our playtests, we had different kinds of people playtesting the game and running the game. And we noticed that when certain kinds of people ran the game, they wanted to make Bluebeard into a sympathetic character. Oh, he's doing this because XYZ, he was raised by a horrible mother or whatever. And we had to think about, did we want that or not? And we decided, no, because this is not what that game is about. Sure, there could be other games where you can take that into account, but we were driving for a very specific thing, where the voice of the game is feminine and is owned by the feminine, and that in itself is such a radical thing that we did not want to dilute it in any way at all. And so basically we were very conscientious about, okay, how are we going to do this sexual violence, and does it work? And so we play with the X card. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that, Jack, but it is a standalone tool that was invented by John Stravellopoulos. And it's basically a way to navigate boundaries with content, so that you are safer to push up against content that you find exciting but maybe really scary, because you know that you have a way to pull back, and you know you have a way to communicate not that thing.
Okay.
And so
kind of like a safe word almost, or in No Thank You, actually have the concept of kids being able to say no thank you evil, and like the game stops because it might be too much. So it's a similar concept.
It's similar. So the X card basically has 2 levels of activation. One is you just tap the X card or say X card, and whatever the thing was that the group was talking about that at that point, whether it's giant spiders or someone's hand creeping up someone else's thigh in the narrative, everyone knows and has agreed upon that signal going, okay, not that thing. So it's like an instant retcon. So you go, oh, it's not giant spiders, it's toads, or oh, that didn't happen, and we do a different thing. And so the X card is integral actually to all kinds of play, not just horror play, in my opinion, where if you don't have a tool to talk about boundaries, then you're going to stumble over the boundaries, right? And people are going to go too far or not far enough, and they're going to have a hard time navigating with each other. So that's really important. And then also, it would be good, we suggest debriefings, where once the game is over, you go, okay, I'm not in my role anymore. I am not that character. Here are my feelings as a person about what just happened. Here are things I liked. Here are things I didn't like. This is maybe something I would do differently. And so you're reorienting towards non-liminal space, right? And you basically rebuild your identity post-game to make sure that you're not caught in there. So we do a lot of things to ensure that it goes off well.
Okay. Well, no, I think that, given the context of the material, I mean, sexuality just as one aspect of culture and what we inherit. I mean, there are, with anything really, there's vast amounts of viewpoints as to how something is taught and how something is received. I mean, the whole identity of rape culture and the identification of power and what defines power. I mean, all these things are, pretty shared, unique ideas. I like that idea of kind of forcing that particular viewpoint. Like, no, we're not going to escape this. This is real for people. So we're not going to be able to avoid that. But I think you also touched on the debrief process, which is, I think, more for just general gaming, because I know that the debriefing, people kind of shy away from that. Like, I talk a lot about like trauma-informed care in gaming, especially with the therapeutic process, setting up a lot of those ground rules and those safety rules. I mean, I think that's one of those things people may not consider, especially in the framework of, we're going to be playing in this culture, and maybe some of the materials. I know we've referenced a couple of different things here or there that, like, Calvin, you were saying about how we don't use the word race in Early Dark. It's heritage instead, that you're kind of like setting a platform for discussion and interaction, but knowing also through that whole safe space generation and also through the debrief process, there's a way to talk about the uncomfortable feels, where I think that debriefing is a process that we kind of do naturally, but it isn't as intense to that area. Like, we all like, hey man, great session, or hey man, that really sucked, I was bored. That's kind of your generic debrief at the end of an RPG. But I think that really analyzing and breaking apart what happened is something that I think we've all kind of talked about, in one way, shape, or form today, about how we take this experience and make it meaningful, because it's not necessarily what we know, it's what we show in a lot of different ways. So kind of with that in mind, and I like the idea of the challenge of mechanics, because we touched on this, and again, I know I'm kind of going off script for questions. I hope you guys don't mind here. I like this idea of exciting story versus being culturally responsive and responsible in terms of research, because it's come up a couple times where we talk about the mechanics. I mean, it's a game that we're trying to create in a lot of ways to explore this. So, I think it actually kind of started with Brian talking about, with Tibet, like certain stories, am I being neglectful of this culture? Am I being insensitive in any way? Because it's like, yeah, this is really cool, but does it make for a good game? So, I mean, what are some of your thoughts? And I know you kind of started us off on that, Strix, about mechanics, being able to, like, where does that all factor in as far as the game? Like, well, I guess, what do you think is the full thrust of what the game should entail if it's being culturally responsible? Like, what game elements do you think are an absolute must if a person's going to game in a culturally responsible way? Yeah, go ahead.
Well,
go ahead and start us off, Strix.
So I became convinced that mechanics were the central linchpin for making sure that happened. There's a lot of things we've talked about today, research and collaboration. But for me, if you want to ensure that the game that people pick up and play works the way you want it to, and that they play in a culturally responsible way, right? Because they could just run off with it and be terrible. You have to do it through the mechanics. And there's this game called How We Came to Live Here by Brendan Taylor. And it's about First Nation societies. And it's one of my favorites. He's since pulled it to work on it again because he realized he had to iterate on the things that he got wrong, working with this First Nation cultural heritage. But basically, his game design informed me a lot because his mechanics make you behave in a certain way socially in his game. And I loved it. And I was like, oh, and the light bulb went on. And I was like, okay, you could write an entire book. You could write paragraphs on how people should play the game. It won't matter unless you can enforce it through mechanics. And so I always look at the mechanics of a game first now. And I'm like, okay, what do these mechanics do to promote what you are trying to design as an experience? Because game design is experience design, which means you have to take into account how you want people to feel. And so you have to design for that. And if you're just like, yeah, +1 to hit the thing, but you aren't telling about why or how you should feel about it or what that means, then that's a huge miss where they're going to take their own cultural biases and their own unconscious ideas and fill that in for you. And then we're back where we started. We're back with the status quo.
Okay. Brian, what do you think about mechanics in game design?
Yeah, one of the things I really focus on is character creation and how that impacts how people play and especially how people see their characters as interacting with the society. I've grew up playing Dungeons and Dragons, and so I love Dungeons and Dragons, but there's that murder hobo aspect of it where you're just you're a wandering person with apparently no connection to anyone else in the society, who just wanders from place to place doing really whatever you want or whatever your alignment will let you do, and it really doesn't give you the characters it tends to produce are not really members of a culture or members of society. They're more just wandering, adventurer murderers. So I really try to focus on character creation and the character options that people are given to define that character's place within the society. My first game, Fates Worse Than Death, it takes place in a near future New York, and it's a cyberpunk game, but I wanted to avoid the cyberpunk stereotypes of you've got this lone mercenary who's just in it for money and doesn't have any connection to anyone. Usually he is a loner and just does whatever he wants. I wanted to avoid that, and I wanted it to the game to be the game takes place specifically on the island of Manhattan in New York, and it's about people trying to make, ideally, I mean, I'm not forcing this down people's throats, but ideally most of the characters are trying to make the city a better place. So your character options really define what groups in the city you're connected to, what groups do you have loyalty to, what cultures are you a part of in the city, and to try to give people that sense that they're not just acting alone, they're acting with and on behalf of other groups of people, and ultimately on the behalf of the city itself, and try to give people a sense that they can actually make the city a better place. Tibet, I tried to do that as well, where it's, you've got your character creation options define your place in society, and who you work with and who you work for, and who works for you, and all that stuff, to try to give people who may not really come into the game really knowing about Tibetan culture or Tibetan society, give them that basic information that they can start playing with some basic idea of this is my place in the society, so that they can actually play as Tibetan, not just a wandering person with powers that just goes and fights monsters and gets treasure.
Right, so it's kind of less of like a role playing, like highway to Tibetan heaven, like you every week a different problem to solve, and here we go through the character and their catchphrases and things like that. Okay, yeah. Calvin, same question.
Yeah, well, I think I kind of mentioned it before, like with what we did with Early Dark, kind of that idea of like where identity comes from or something, right? The mechanic of character creation, instead of having alignments to like ideals or behavior, you have alignments to groups, right? They're all social. But also, yeah, I mean, I think what Strix said too about agency, I guess that's the big thing for us, and when we design things, is this, it's art through adversity, it's like character through constraints, right? Or character through conflict. Like, you can't just do whatever you want. You're not going to then learn anything. You're just going to keep being you, right? And I think in most role-playing games, like I role-play a lot at conventions, right? And a lot of people come in with their pre-made characters, and they know exactly who they want to be. And sadly, with all of our games and Anthropos games, you can't do that, right? You can't be, I guess, who you want. You are produced through the different processes. And I guess just as a mechanical example, then in the character creation, in Early Dark, yeah, one, you pick these memberships, but it actually changes your stats or your aptitude. So if you want to have a +1 to fight, you have to be in one, you'd have to be in this age group, not this age group, right? So you'll have your age, you'll have your gender, you'll have like pretty much like your class, you'll have some membership set up. And so if, for example, if you want to have a +1 guile, you can't have a +1 guile and like be a woman, right? Like in this culture, the people that succeed very well in this, if you want to get a +1 guile, you have to choose this caste, this gender, or whatever it might be, right? So you can kind of be whatever you want, but it forces you to, the player then is like, wait, why can't I be that and that? And it's like, well, in this culture, to be someone that succeeds and uses guile, we said their aptitudes, right? Someone who is apt to use guile would be in, would find themselves in this group, or would be in this group, thus then use guile, right? And so through that character creation process, it kind of like forces them to think about it differently, right? Or, if you want to have a +1 to labor and size, like, oh, guess what? You're in the laboring caste now. Like, have fun with, getting out of that or becoming a murder hobo when like you've got to feed your family or something, right? So, I mean, this idea of, even like the choice, but then the character through these choices of embedding into cultural situations, I guess is, pretty much the top like mechanical thing, right? As Brian said, right? Character creation is a really good spot for that. And so, yeah, so we focus on agency, constraint, even in Fantaji. Then the second game, you don't really know what you're going to be doing till after a roll sometimes, right? So it's almost like consulting the bones a little bit, or like you don't just have free choice, right? So I guess we play with agency a lot, and help people embody things differently, or just kind of cut down that big Western notion of like the the Cartesian self or something, is one of, I guess, the more progressive things we do.
All right, Jason, same question.
Well, Strix was preaching my gospel a few minutes ago. Like, there have been people who come with me like, "Oh, Jason, you gotta see this game. It's all the things that you talk about. You'll love it. It's so great." And it says it's all those things, but then when you actually play it, it's roll the dice, and here's your stat on your character sheet, and you add this, and do you overcome the number? And you haven't done anything with the mechanics to actually make me feel like I'm in some other world or that I'm acting in some other way. You haven't incentivized me to make decisions in a different way at all. One of the first. No, the first version of the Fifth World that I play tested was abysmal, absolute abject failure, because I kind of went with the typical way that you do in an RPG, because I'm like, this is the way that you do an RPG. There's no other way to do an RPG. I can't imagine any other way that an RPG could be. So you roll the dice, you have the stats on your character sheet, and I threw on some things around the edges that I thought were cool, but ultimately the core of the game was still the same type of dynamics as D&D. So we would play, and these people would express their worldview and the way that they thought the world worked and the way they related to each other. And then the mechanics would engage, and it felt so condescending because the game was patting my character on the head and saying, "That's adorable that you think the world is like that. It's actually individual people overcoming obstacles. Your whole idea of things are all relationships. That's adorable, but no, we're going to do the real thing now." And I realized that I had to just completely change that. I had to have mechanics that actually reflected the way they saw the world. I'm not sure that you can do that generically. I don't actually believe that there is such a thing as a generic system. What we call generic systems are Western systems. They have the Western concept of the Cartesian self embedded in the fact that I have a single solitary character sheet. Like in the Fifth World, we're getting to the point where most of the information about my character is on other people's character sheets, and I'm thinking that helps reinforce what anthropologists have been calling a dividual sense of self, where it's not that everything is inside me, but I am a node in this network defined by my relationships with others. Instead of dice, we have cards. So the question isn't, can I overcome? It's what lies beneath. What do I discover, right? So things like that, that you can, the mechanics can shift you into the mindset of how that culture works and how these people see the world. I don't think you can do that generically. I think you can take a particular culture's concept of how the world works, and that means that all the other cultures, you're kind of telling them they're wrong, at least in the context of this game, because they may say that how the world works, but then ultimately we're going to go back to this is how the world actually works. That's a limitation of gaming, but it's also a power of gaming, because if you want to share how this other culture sees the world, it's very easy to invite people in, and all they have to do is play the game. You don't need to explain. You don't have to write a thesis paper about how this is how they see the world. Simply engaging in the game and playing it is enough to see how they see the world. So, yeah, definitely mechanics.
Nice. So we're getting about ready to wrap up, and I'll kind of do my little Jerry Springer time for final thoughts. But I know, just to kind of add my own 2 cents in here, one of the big things that I'm actually kind of accoladed from a lot of my players and sessions is the nature of consequences. I know that it was briefly touched on here, but I think that's absolutely huge in showing that murder hoboing is a great idea, but what happens when you kill all the different people from the warring tribe? How does it affect your economy? How does it affect your belief system in terms of death? I mean, do those people go to your heaven? Do they go to a different? There's so many ideas that I think just through the also besides the mechanic aspect, also through the narrative. I mean, creating these lush worlds with real questions and real scenarios, definitely can allow us to explore and expand our ideas. And that's really what I think we're talking about in general throughout not only this episode, but pretty much every other episode with the Game to Grow Webisode project, which is about expanding your awareness to what your gaming can bring to you and to your experience in the world, whether it's from a simple developmental perspective of like engaging socially to developing more of a critical think type of mindset, to developing resiliency, simple education. Second ed D&D source books. I learned a lot about other cultures because maybe not everything that there was to learn, but there were very informative source books about historical periods of time. So I mean, there's a lot of aspects to this, and definitely this is a bottle not easily recorked. But I know that, before we go to final thoughts from everybody, I hope that the discussion today has enhanced your mind, enhanced your view, and hopefully gotten you to think about gaming in a slightly different way. What we'll do then is, when we have this added to the Game to Grow playlist, I'm going to make sure to put links to all of these fine folks' creations and their storehouses therein. So you can, share a little bit and delve a little bit more into what they were discussing today, to again expand your gaming library and your gaming experience, to kind of introduce a new world to you. So I guess we can just kind of finish out with either like a final thought, or maybe a recommendation that you might have to people who want to be more culturally responsible when they look at their gaming hobby or their gaming habit. So why don't we have Calvin start us off?
Yeah, I guess, closing thoughts, just about that culturally responsible gaming then. I guess, I'll go back to so many things that people have said so far, right? But for me, a game is a world, right? A game allows certain it's an ontology, right? It allows certain things to exist. It excludes other things from existing. And so a game is really a great place to have someone inhabit a different subjectivity. Not just agency in the sense of making choices, but then subjectivity, in this, to be embodied in a certain way in a certain world. And so, it's a huge power, right? More so than other forms of art, maybe in certain ways, right? This to adjust someone to a different ontology, right? To force a certain kind of subjectivity on them. And I can totally imagine what Strix was talking about, with these guys, like, oh my gosh, it blew my mind. I've never had my agency restricted before because I'm a man living in a sexist world. Oh my gosh, I can't believe it. And you're like, yeah, buddy, so the idea that games can allow that, I think is really, a takeaway point for people. And that, again, something Strix said, right? But all games are political. Everything we do is political, right? There's no it's just a game. Mythology is just a game. Let's let it be itself. No, right? Everything we do is political. Everything we do is social. Everything we do has consequences for other people. And so, just remembering that, I think, is important. And then we as designers, again, not to pounce on people if they make mistakes, right? I'll make mistakes all the time, and I hope, I've had so many people come up, just as as a white male in an anthropology department, right? Having, going through this and having people like, hey, here's what, different people's experiences are. Here's what this is. And having me like, shoot, I messed up. I'm learning. I'm still learning, right? Fail early, fail often. So I guess it works in academics. It works in game design for sure. But games are powerful little worlds.
Nice. And I guess kind of further, any plugs that you might want to throw in? Those are definitely fair and open game here.
Oh, well, I think Jason mentioned before about how a generic system can't maybe do that. And I was like, wait, our generic system, Fantaji, does that. But then I immediately thought, but it does it better in our campaign setting. Oh, shoot, he's right. But yeah, this idea of, and we have assemblage I that Jack, I've actually talked to you about for a long time, right? But a character, you don't have a character, you have a craft. Like, you are a child with a stuffed animal and a particular song. And if the child and stuffed animal get cut out, you're still then just the song. And then you're waiting for someone else to learn the song. And now you're this person in this song and this object. And so you're constantly this assemblage. You're never the individual, right? And so we're really pushing that, but that kind of comes with maybe part of the campaign setting too. But and that's, exploring these different kinds of subjectivity, I guess, is just really important to reiterate. But with assemblage I and with Fantaji, we really try to do that.
Yeah, I love just the whole idea of using the word assemblage. It takes me back to all my Castaneda, and all of that that I've read, years. Oh my gosh. Jason, final thoughts.
I think it's easy to come at this from a kind of guilt-centric point of view of, I want to avoid doing the bad thing and that's it. But I think it's probably better to come at it from a perspective of curiosity. The world is bigger and wilder and more interesting and more colorful than no matter how much that statement is still true. And in turn, I think that if you are just more curious, that's probably the best antidote to being culturally irresponsible that you can have, to always be learning more, to not be satisfied with the glib answer, to push past the stereotypes, to have that curiosity always burning, to push further and see the complexities that are there, because no matter how much you know, there's still more complexity there.
Sorry, Brian, I have my mic muted.
All right. Well, my advice for game designers would be, either be willing to do the research into the cultures and with engaging members of those cultures being the best kind of research, or don't use that culture in a game if you're not willing to do the research. And that for me would include those pseudo cultures, the pseudo Asians and the pseudo Africans and pseudo Native Americans. Another piece of advice for game designers would be to really be stern with artists. In a nice way, of course, but don't just let them get away with poor representations of other people. And there's a really good blog I would really recommend called "Go Make Me a Sandwich," and the blog is run by an artist, and she really breaks down game art and how it represents people and different types of people, and does it represent them fairly and well. And I strongly recommend that blog for anyone who does any kind of art direction. I'd also advise, make settings more diverse. There's too many settings that I think it's a misguided attempt to be realistic. They make these monocultures, like here's our medieval Europe. There's only white Europeans there, and it's a monoculture, and there's no other peoples there, and that's it's not realistic, and it's not diverse, and it doesn't lend to diverse gameplay. So I would recommend avoid that sort of monoculture setting design. I'd also say, and this is advice for both game designers and for GMs, avoid NPCs or character classes that can be described in a short phrase. This is actually a piece of advice that I put into the introduction to Hoodoo Blues, because I was worried, people are going to create these characters, NPCs that are gangsta thug, or good old boy, or racist redneck, or something like that. Something that's consolidating a character down to a really basic stereotype, and that's just it's just poor. It's just a poor way of if you find that you can describe your character in one phrase, the character needs to be fleshed out. The character needs more detail added to it, because that's you're at that point you're just perpetuating stereotypes, and it's just not good storytelling to have characters that are based on these simplistic stereotypes. I'd also say I think people of all cultures want the world to benefit from those cultures. They want people to learn what those cultures have to offer. So it doesn't have to be an adversarial relationship. I think they want, most every culture, they want that culture to be shared. They just want people to do it respectfully. They want people to take from their culture, but to do so respectfully and in a way that doesn't evidence a power imbalance. So I think it's good work that we're doing to include other cultures in our games, and that we should definitely keep doing it.
Awesome, very nice. And Strix, you want to close this out from the panel end?
Yeah. So Jason stole my thunder a little, but I just have to say, I'm excited. I am excited that we are having these conversations, because what it means is we as gamers are going to get access to more and more interesting stories, perspectives that we get to explore for the first time, new experiences. I guess I'm a kind of like an Epicurean of games. I want to try all the different things, all the different emotions, all the different settings, all the different perspectives. And I think we're moving in a direction as a gaming culture, even though that itself is not monolithic, where we can do that better and we can do it more effectively. And I just can't wait to see how much opens up when we start doing this in a way that is responsible, but also really taps into perspectives that some of us have never had before. So for myself, I would say definitely check out what I put out there. I run a Twitch show weekly. We just finished our first season, called Weekly Affirmations. All of the episodes are free on YouTube, and on my show we explore indie and freeform games. So really like what mechanics can do. There is one game we played where like fire, like actual fire is a mechanic. It's fabulous. But we also have roundtables where we talk about emotional bleed. We talk about all kinds of things to do with psychology and mythology and games. And it's a community of people, 200-ish people tune in every week, and they participate in chat. And we have open conversations, and it's a very respectful, very positive place. That's why it's called Weekly Affirmations. So definitely check that out. I also have my own website where all of my published papers, all of my work on diversity and inclusion are linked. That website is strixworks.com, STRIXWERKS. And I'm on Twitter, _the_Strix. So feel free to hit me up there. I'm very open to having conversations. And play minority settings, play minority characters, do things you haven't done before, because you will enjoy it.
All right. Well, on behalf of the Game to Grow Webisode project, I want to thank everybody for appearing today. We had some great conversations, some great thought. I think some great directions as to where people can go. And what I will do is after we close out the live broadcast, I'll ask my fellow panelists to kind of stick around. We'll talk about what links and such to send. So when we go ahead, links will be posted. We do have actually a Game to Grow channel on YouTube that you can actually see all the past episodes that we've had. We are kind of looking forward to trying to set up like a warehouse or a web location where you can kind of, website designed around all of this, so we can also do like maybe, some ancillary or secondary episodes. But if you go to that YouTube page, which is just, Game to Grow channel, please send us ideas for topics that you would like us to explore, because, we have some great ideas, but, if we're doing this for you guys instead of just for our own, loving to hear my radio voice, then, it's really not quite as impactful as we would like this to be, because we want to get people thinking. We want to get people, as we've said here, doing things differently and doing different things. So with all that in mind, thank you. This is a close to the 2016 series, 6 episodes in the can, as it were. And we're already looking forward to 2017. So from all of us to all of you, happy gaming, and take care of each other. Be well.